The coffee hit the stove wrong and exploded across Mara's hand before she could jerk it back. Hot liquid splashed over her wrist, burned through the threadbare sleeve of her dress, but she didn't make a sound, just grabbed the rag hanging from her apron and wrapped it tight while the pot clattered against the iron grate. Pain was information. Nothing more. She'd learned that lesson young, and it had kept her alive through circumstances most people couldn't imagine surviving. The kitchen around her looked like something out of a nightmare about frontier life gone wrong. Grease had fossilized on the walls in dark streaks. The floorboards were so filthy they'd gone gray. Cupboards hung crooked on broken hinges, and when she'd opened the pantry earlier that morning, something with too many legs had skittered across her boot. The whole house smelled like neglect and unwashed bodies and something else, something harder to name. Desperation, maybe. The particular stink of people who'd stopped believing things could get better. Mara had smelled it before, in mining camps and failed homesteads and the temporary shelters where women like her ended up when they ran out of options and geography. She knew that smell intimately because, for most of her life, she'd carried it with her. The telegram had arrived 3 weeks ago at the boarding house in Silverton, where she'd been washing dishes for room and board. Simple message. Widowed rancher seeks cook. One evening meal, fair wages. Black Hollow Ranch, Dusk Ridge Valley. She should have known better. Fair wages on the frontier usually meant whatever the employer felt like paying after the work was done. And one evening meal was code for, we need someone desperate enough to work for almost nothing. But Mara had been down to her last $2, and winter was coming, and desperation made people believe lies they'd otherwise see through. So she'd packed her 2 carpet bags, everything she owned in the world fit into 2 bags, and taken the supply wagon that ran mail routes through the valley settlements. The ranch sat at the absolute dead edge of civilization, where the decent grazing land gave way to alkali flats and volcanic rock. The kind of place people ended up when they'd been pushed off better ground by drought or debt or violence. The house itself looked abandoned from a distance. Shutters hung sideways. The porch sagged. Fences leaned like broken teeth against the horizon. She'd almost turned around right then. But she needed the money. Needed it badly enough to ignore every instinct screaming at her that this place was wrong. The rancher who met her at the door looked worse than his property. Cade Mercer was maybe 40 years old, but he moved like someone much older, shoulders bent under invisible weight, face lined deep with exhaustion that went bone deep. His clothes were clean enough, but patched in a dozen places, and his hands were scarred from work that never ended. "You the cook?" His voice came out flat, not rude, just empty. "I am." "Good. Boys are hungry." He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer to carry her bags, just turned and walked back into the dark interior of the house, leaving her standing on the porch wondering what exactly she'd gotten herself into. The answer became clear the moment she stepped inside. 6 boys sat around a splintered table in the main room, all of them staring at her with expressions ranging from hostile to hungry to something that looked uncomfortably like hope. Nobody had mentioned 6 children in the telegram. The oldest couldn't have been more than 16, tall and lean, with his father's dark eyes and a hardness in his face that boys that age shouldn't have. He watched her the way guard dogs watched strangers, calculating whether she was a threat or just another disappointment. The others ranged down in age like stair-steps. Another teenager with a split lip and bruised knuckles. A thin boy about 12 who looked like he hadn't slept properly in months. 2 more in between, both wearing shirts so patched they were more repair than original fabric. And then the youngest, maybe 6 years old, small for his age, sitting at the far end of the table with huge eyes that tracked her every movement like he was terrified she might vanish if he looked away. That look hit her harder than the burn on her wrist. She'd seen that expression before, in mirrors, back when she was young enough to still believe someone might save her. "This is Mara Vale," Cade said to the room, his tone making it clear he didn't expect questions. "She's cooking tonight. You'll show respect." The boys didn't respond, just kept staring. Mara set her bags down slowly, carefully, like she was approaching spooked animals. "Which one of you can show me the kitchen?" The youngest started to stand, but the oldest boy shot him a look that froze him in place. "I'll show you," the teenager said, standing with the kind of careful control that suggested he was used to being in charge. "This way." The kitchen was worse than the main room. Burned pans were stacked in the dry sink, some of them scorched so badly the metal had warped. The pump handle hung loose, She'd have to fix that before she could even get water. Flour had spilled across the counter and hardened into a crust that looked weeks old. In the corner, she spotted a pot of something that might have been beans once, now covered in a layer of mold thick enough to have texture. "When did you last have a real meal?" she asked the boy, keeping her voice neutral. He shrugged. "We eat." "That's not what I asked." He met her eyes then, and she saw something flicker behind the careful blankness. "Ma died 14 months ago. We've been managing." Managing, that was one word for it. "What's your name?" Mara asked. "Jonah." "Well, Jonah, I'm going to need you to haul water, at least 4 buckets, and find me firewood that's actually dry." He looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "You're really going to cook?" "That's what I'm here for." The last woman father hired lasted 3 hours. He said it matter of fact, like it was just information, not a warning. Mara started rolling up her sleeves. "Then I guess we'll see if I make it to 4. She worked fast after that, not because she was trying to impress anyone, but because cooking was one of the few things in her life she'd ever been able to control. When everything else fell apart, and it always did, she could still make food that tasted like something other than survival. The pantry was a disaster, but she found what she needed: dried venison that hadn't gone completely rancid, beans that looked mostly intact, flour that still had some life in it, potatoes in the root cellar that were sprouting but salvageable. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She got the fire going hot, set water to boil, started soaking beans she should have soaked the night before, but that would have to do. The venison she cut into small pieces and browned hard in the big skillet, adding wild onions she'd spotted growing near the pump outside. Jonah brought the water without being asked twice, which surprised her. Stood in the doorway watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You need something?" she asked without looking up from the stove. "Just wondering if you're going to run." "Not before I finish cooking." "That's what the last one said." Mara turned to look at him then, really look, and what she saw was a 16-year-old boy trying to be a man before he'd figured out how to stop being a child. Angry, scared, exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. "I'm not running," she said quietly. "Not tonight, anyway." Something in his face shifted. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of a question about whether trust was possible. He left without responding, and Mara went back to cooking. The stew came together slowly, rich and dark, the kind that made a house smell like home instead of just shelter. She made skillet bread to go with it. Nothing fancy, just flour and water and salt, but cooked right so it came out crispy on the edges and soft in the middle. By the time she carried the first pot out to the main room, the sun had set completely, and the house had gone dark except for a few oil lamps burning low. All 6 boys were still sitting at the table, waiting. She served them in order of age, starting with Jonah, then working her way down. Nobody spoke. They just watched as she ladled stew into mismatched bowls, set out the bread, poured water from the pitcher she'd cleaned earlier. When she got to the youngest boy, he looked up at her with those huge eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Something in her chest tightened painfully. "You're welcome," she managed. "What's your name?" "Eli." "That's a good name." Cade sat at the head of the table, silent, watching the whole scene like he wasn't quite sure it was real. When she finally served him last, he nodded once but didn't meet her eyes. Then they ate. Not politely, not slowly. Like starving men, all of them, even Cade, like this was the first real meal they'd had in longer than they wanted to admit. Mara stood near the kitchen doorway and watched them, arms crossed, trying to ignore the tight feeling in her chest that she recognized as dangerous. Caring was dangerous. Attachment was worse. She was supposed to cook one meal, collect her wages, and leave before dawn. That was the plan. But plans had a way of falling apart when you weren't looking. When the stew was gone and the boys had soaked up the last of it with bread that disappeared faster than she'd thought possible, Eli slid off his chair and carried his bowl toward the kitchen with both hands. "I'll wash," he said, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "You don't have to. I want to help." And there it was again, that look. The one that said, "Please don't leave," without using any words at all. Mara felt something crack open inside her that she'd worked very hard to keep sealed shut. "All right," she heard herself say. "But you have to pump while I wash. Deal?" The smile that broke across his face was so sudden and so genuine that it physically hurt to look at. Deal. They cleaned the kitchen together while the older boys cleared the table behind them. Jonah organized the others with quiet efficiency, sending the middle ones outside to deal with livestock, directing the teenager with the split lip to stack firewood, keeping everything moving like a drill sergeant who'd learned the hard way that discipline was the only thing standing between order and chaos. Cade disappeared into what she assumed was his room without saying goodnight. By the time everything was scrubbed and stacked and the fire was banked for the night, full dark had settled over the ranch like a physical weight. No moon, no clouds, just stars so bright and cold they looked like ice chips scattered across black glass. Mara stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in air that smelled like sage and distance and absolute emptiness. This was the moment to leave. Walk down that road. Don't look back. Collect her pay, if Cade actually intended to pay her, and get back to Silverton before winter closed the passes. But Eli had gone to bed smiling, and that shouldn't have mattered, but it did. You really stay in the night? Jonah's voice came from the darkness near the barn. She turned. He was leaning against the fence rail, barely visible, except for the ember of a hand-rolled cigarette glowing between his fingers. That was the agreement, Mara said. Agreements don't mean much out here. They mean something to me. He took a drag, exhaled slowly. We don't have much money. Father probably told you he'd pay fair, but fair isn't what you're thinking. I know. So why'd you come? Good question. One she'd been asking herself since the moment she stepped off that supply wagon. Same reason anyone comes anywhere, she said finally. Ran out of better options. Jonah laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Yeah, that's how we all end up here, isn't it? At the dead end of everywhere. He wasn't wrong. Black Hollow Ranch felt exactly like the kind of place people washed up when the current finally stopped carrying them. The last stop before you either figured out how to survive or you didn't. Your brothers? Mara said carefully. They always this quiet? They weren't always. He flicked ash onto the dirt. Used to be noise everywhere, laughter, fighting, normal kid stuff. Then Ma died and everything just stopped. How'd she die? Fever. Came on fast, dead in 4 days. His voice went flat when he said it, the way voices did when people had told a story too many times and couldn't afford to feel it anymore. Father tried to get her to town. Roads were flooded. By the time the water dropped, she was gone. Mara didn't say she was sorry. Sorry didn't help. She knew that better than most. That's why the house looks like this, Jonah continued. Why we look like this. Father couldn't keep up with everything, and we were too young to know how to help. Things just started falling apart, slowly at first, then all at once. And the women he hired before me lasted a few hours, maybe a day. They'd take one look at this place and realize they couldn't fix it, so they'd leave. He paused. Can't really blame them. But he did blame them. She could hear it in his voice, the anger beneath the resignation. What makes you think I'm different? Mara asked. Jonah looked at her directly then, his face half shadowed by starlight. Because you didn't flinch when you saw us. Everyone else did. Looked at us like we were something broken beyond repair. You just started cooking. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind move through the darkness and the distant sound of cattle shifting in their sleep. Finally, Jonah crushed out his cigarette and pushed off the fence. Father set up a cot for you in the room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's clean. I made sure. Thank you. He nodded and started to walk away, then stopped. Mara? Yeah? Don't disappear before morning. Please. Eli's been watching the door since you got here. If he wakes up and you're gone... He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. I'll be here, she promised, and she meant it, at least for tonight. The room was small and cold and smelled faintly of mildew, but the cot had been made up with clean blankets, and someone had left a lamp burning low on the floor. Mara sat on the edge of the thin mattress and unlaced her boots slowly, feeling exhaustion settle into her bones like sediment at the bottom of a river. She should sleep. Instead, she sat there in the dim light, staring at her 2 carpet bags sitting against the wall, thinking about all the places she'd run from and all the reasons why. The mining camp where the foreman's hands went places they shouldn't. The boarding house where the owner locked up the food and counted every bite. The ranch outside Silverton, where she'd lasted 2 weeks before the rancher's wife decided Mara was a threat just by existing. She'd gotten good at leaving, good at packing fast, good at recognizing the signs that a place was about to turn dangerous, good at severing attachments before they had time to root deep. But sitting here in this broken-down house at the edge of nowhere, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and the soft breathing of sleeping children somewhere beyond the wall, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Tired. Not physically. She was always physically tired. That was just life. But tired of running, tired of starting over, tired of being alone in rooms exactly like this one, counting her money and calculating how long until she had to move again. She lay back on the cot and pulled the blanket up to her chin, staring at the ceiling where shadows moved in the lamplight like ghosts. Tomorrow she'd leave, take whatever payment Kate offered, if he offered any, and get back to Silverton before the weather turned. That was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But when she finally closed her eyes, the last thing she saw was Eli's face at the dinner table, smiling for the first time in who knew how long, and she felt that dangerous crack in her chest widen just a little bit more. Humph. Mara woke to the sound of boots on floorboards and whispers that weren't quite quiet enough. She kept her eyes closed, breathing steady, listening. Has to be somewhere, check the kitchen again. What if she already left? She couldn't have. The gate was still locked. Jonah's voice cut through the others, sharp and commanding. All of you shut up. You're going to wake her. Silence. Then Eli's small voice, wavering. But where are her bags? Mara's eyes snapped open. She sat up fast, looked at the corner where she'd left her carpet bags last night. Empty. Gone. For one disorienting moment, pure panic flooded through her. The instinctive terror of losing everything you owned in a world where everything fit into 2 bags. Then understanding hit like cold water. The boys had taken them, hidden them. She was on her feet and out the door before conscious thought caught up with emotion, bursting into the kitchen where all 6 boys froze like deer startled by lamplight. Jonah stood near the stove. Micah, the one with the bruised knuckles, was halfway to the door. The middle boys huddled together near the table, and Eli stood in the center of the room, clutching something against his chest, one of her bags. Give it back, Mara said, voice level, but hard. Nobody moved. I said give it back. Louder now. Sharp enough that Eli flinched. We can't, Jonah said quietly. The hell you can't. Please. Eli's voice cracked around the word. Please don't go. And just like that, Mara's anger collapsed into something more complicated. She looked at these 6 boys standing in a broken kitchen in the early morning light, all of them wearing expressions somewhere between defiance and desperation, and she understood exactly what they'd done. This wasn't cruelty. It was survival. They weren't trying to trap her. They were trying to keep the first good thing that had happened to them in over a year from disappearing like everything else had disappeared. Where's the other bag? She asked, softer now. Barn loft, Micah muttered. We'll give them back. Just stay, please. For how long? The boys looked at each other. Eli's eyes filled with tears he was fighting hard not to shed. Just a few more days, Jonah said. Father can't pay much, but we'll figure something out. We'll work harder. Cut costs somewhere. Just, you can't buy me, Mara interrupted. We're not trying to buy you, Jonah shot back, suddenly angry. We're trying to survive. Look around. Look at us. You think we're okay? You think we're fine? She looked, really looked. At the exhaustion carved into faces too young to carry it. At clothes held together with string and hope. At a house collapsing slowly under the weight of grief and poverty and too many people drowning all at once. And she saw herself reflected back. Every version of herself she'd ever been, standing in rooms like this, watching families break apart because nobody had the strength left to hold things together. She could walk away. Should walk away. That was what survivors did. They recognized sinking ships and got off before the water closed over their heads. But when Eli took a step toward her, still clutching that carpet bag like a lifeline, Mara heard herself say something she knew she'd regret. 3 days. Eli's face transformed. Really? 3 days, she repeated firmly. I'll stay 3 days. Help get things organized. Teach you how to manage better. Then I'm gone. That's the deal. We'll take it, Jonah said immediately, before she could change her mind. And you give me back my bags. Right now. Both of them. Micah bolted out the door toward the barn. Eli handed over the bag he'd been holding with hands that shook slightly. Mara took it, felt the familiar weight of her few possessions, and wondered what the hell she'd just agreed to. 3 days. She could manage 3 days. Teach them some basics. Get the house functional, then leave before she got tangled up in their problems any deeper than she already was. That was the plan. But the frontier had a way of turning 3 days into something that looked a lot like forever. And by the time Mara realized what was happening, it would be far too late to run. The 3 days started badly and got worse. Mara spent the first morning discovering exactly how deep the damage went. Not just the surface mess, the burned pans and filthy floors, but the structural rot underneath. The kind that happened when people stopped maintaining things because they'd lost the energy to care. The pump in the kitchen had a cracked seal that leaked half the water before it reached the basin. The root cellar door hung on one hinge and let in enough cold air to freeze everything that wasn't supposed to freeze. 3 of the windows had cracks stuffed with rags instead of glass. The chimney in the main room drew smoke wrong, which explained why everything smelled like a campfire gone bad. And that was just the house. The barn was worse. Stalls that hadn't been mucked properly in weeks. Tack so dry and cracked it was dangerous to use. A hayloft with boards rotted through in places where you could fall straight down and break your neck if you weren't careful. Mara stood in the barn doorway that first afternoon, arms crossed, looking at the scope of the disaster, and felt something close to despair. 3 days wasn't going to fix this. 3 months might not fix this. But she'd made a promise, and breaking promises was something she tried not to do, so she rolled up her sleeves and started making lists. The boys watched her with a mix of suspicion and cautious hope, like they weren't sure whether to trust that she meant to stay even the 3 days she'd agreed to. Jonas shadowed her constantly, silent and evaluating, waiting for her to prove herself like the others had failed to do. Micah kept his distance, but she caught him watching from corners, fists always half-clenched like he expected a fight to break out any second. Finn, the quiet one who looked like he hadn't slept in months, just drifted through his chores like a ghost, barely speaking even when spoken to. The 2 middle boys, whose names she learned were Daniel and Samuel, stuck together like they'd decided there was safety in numbers. And Eli followed her everywhere. Kitchen, barn, root cellar. Didn't matter. Wherever Mara went, that small shadow came trailing behind, watching her with those huge eyes that still held too much fear. "Don't you have chores?" she asked him on the second morning, not unkindly, while she was trying to organize the pantry into something that made functional sense. "Did them already." "All of them?" "Yes, ma'am." She turned to look at him. He stood in the doorway holding a bucket that was almost as big as he was, water sloshing over the sides. "I brought more water, he added quietly, "in case you need it." Her chest did that tight thing again, the dangerous thing. "Thank you," she managed. "You can set it by the stove." He did, then stood there uncertainly, like he was waiting for permission to exist in the same room. "Eli," Mara said carefully, "you don't have to follow me around all day." His face fell so fast it was almost comical. "I'm bothering you." "No, that's not what I meant. I'll go." He was already backing toward the door. "Wait." She set down the jar of preserves she'd been examining and crouched to his level. "Come here." He approached slowly, cautiously, like approaching wild animals. "You're not bothering me," Mara said, meeting his eyes. "I just don't want you to feel like you have to earn the right to have me around." I said 3 days. I'm staying 3 days, whether you bring me water or not. Understand? Eli nodded, but she could see he didn't really believe it. He'd been abandoned too many times to take promises at face value. She understood that better than she wanted to. "How about this?" Mara offered. "If you want to help, you can sort these jars for me. Separate anything that looks spoiled from the ones that are still good. Think you can do that?" His face lit up like she'd handed him something precious. "I can do that." "Good. Get started." He attacked the task with an intensity that was almost painful to watch, checking each jar like his life depended on getting it right. Mara went back to scrubbing shelves and tried not to think about what would happen when the 3 days were up, and she had to walk away from this strange, broken family that had somehow decided she was worth keeping. Kate appeared around midday, materializing in the kitchen doorway like a man who wasn't entirely sure he was allowed in his own house. "Need to talk to you," he said without preamble. Mara straightened, pushing hair back from her forehead with the back of one wrist. All right. He glanced at Eli, who was still sorting jars with intense concentration. Private. They walked out to the porch. The day had gone cold and gray, clouds building in the north like a promise of early snow. Wind moved through the empty spaces between buildings, carrying dust and the smell of distance. Cade leaned against the railing, not looking at her. Boys told me about the 3 days. I imagine they did. That your idea or theirs? Does it matter? He was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. I can't pay you much. Ranch is barely holding together as it is. Lost half the herd to drought last summer. Lost more to rustlers this fall. Banks circling. If winter hits hard... He didn't finish the sentence. Mara waited. What I'm saying is, 3 days is probably all I can afford anyway. So if you're planning to leave after that, better you do it clean. Don't let them get attached. I think they're already attached. Then unattach them. He said it harsh, but she heard the desperation underneath. I've seen what happens when people leave, especially Eli. Boy barely talked for 6 months after his mother died, just now starting to come back. If you walk out on him... I'm not walking out, Mara said, sharper than she intended. I'm leaving. There's a difference. Not to a 6-year-old there isn't. He was right. She knew he was right. But that didn't change the fact that she couldn't stay permanently in a place this broken, with people this damaged, when she was barely holding herself together. You got any family? Cade asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. No. None at all. None that matters. He looked at her then, really looked, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe. The kind that happened when one damaged person recognized another. You running from something? Everyone's running from something, Mara said flatly. Out here, that's just called Tuesday. A sound that might have been a laugh caught in his throat. Fair enough. They stood in silence for a while. Somewhere in the distance, cattle were lowing. Closer by, she could hear the boys working, hammering something in the barn. Voices raised an argument that didn't quite turn into fighting. Your boys are good kids, Mara said eventually. Scared, angry, but good. They're half feral, Cade corrected. I love them, but I'm not blind. Jonah's turning mean. Micah's got a temper that's going to get him killed. Finn barely speaks. And Eli... He stopped, jaw working. Eli needs a mother. I can't be that. I'm failing at being a father as it is. You're keeping them alive. That counts. Alive isn't the same as living. No, it wasn't. Mara knew that better than most. She'd spent years being alive without actually living, moving from place to place like a ghost, existing but not inhabiting her own life. Look, Cade said, turning to face her fully. I'm not asking you to fix us. Nobody can do that. But 3 days isn't enough time to teach them anything that'll stick. If you're going to leave anyway, might as well go now before they start hoping. I made a promise. Promises break. Not mine. Something flickered in his eyes. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the space where hope used to live before it got beaten out of him by circumstance. 3 days then, he said. After that, I'll pay you what I can and we'll call it square. Square, Mara agreed. But neither of them moved to shake on it, and she had the distinct feeling they'd just negotiated something neither of them actually believed would hold. The rest of that day passed in hard work that left her hands raw and her back aching. She taught the boys how to properly clean the kitchen, not just surface wiping, but actual deep cleaning that killed the bacteria making them sick. Showed them how to organize supplies so they could see what they had before it spoiled. Made them help repair the pump seal using leather scraps and patience. They resisted at first. Not openly, but with the kind of passive resistance that came from being too tired to care anymore. Except Eli. He threw himself into every task like it was the most important thing in the world. By evening, Mara was exhausted enough that her hands shook when she started cooking dinner. Nothing fancy, just beans and cornbread and some salted pork she'd found buried in the back of the smokehouse. But when she served it, the boys ate like it was a feast. This is good, Daniel said around a mouthful, then looked surprised that he'd spoken out loud. Better than good, Samuel added. Even Finn nodded agreement, which seemed to be the most communication he was capable of. Micah ate in silence, but she noticed he took seconds without being offered, which was its own kind of compliment. Jonah watched her throughout the meal with that evaluating look, like he was cataloging everything she did to figure out where the trick was. Cade said nothing but cleaned his plate, and when she collected the dishes afterward, he muttered something that might have been thank you. That night, Eli appeared in the doorway of her small room just as she was getting ready to sleep. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Sure." "Are you really leaving in 3 days?" Mara sat on the edge of the cot and looked at this small boy who'd already lost too much. She could lie. Make it easier. But lies had a way of hurting worse than truth in the long run. "Yes," she said quietly. "I am." His face crumpled slightly, but he nodded like he'd expected it. "That's what I thought." Eli, "It's okay." He was backing away now. "I understand. Nobody stays, that's just how it is." He disappeared before she could respond, and Mara sat in the darkness feeling like she'd just done something cruel even though she'd only told the truth. The second day dawned cold and stayed that way. Frost covered everything by morning, and the clouds that had been threatening snow finally made good on the promise. Not much. Just light flurries that melted as soon as they hit the ground, but enough to make everyone move faster, knowing real winter wasn't far behind. Mara spent most of the day working with the older boys on barn repairs. Jonah knew more than she expected about carpentry, but he'd been trying to do everything himself and had gotten overwhelmed. Together they replaced the rotted boards in the loft, patched holes in the walls where wind was getting through, reorganized the tack room into something functional. Micah worked alongside them, mostly silent, but occasionally making comments that were almost funny if you caught them right. "This whole barn's held together with spit and prayer," he muttered while hammering down a board. "And neither of those are in good supply," Jonah added. Mara paused, hammer mid-swing. "You two always this cheerful?" They looked at each other, then at her, and something almost like smiles flickered across both faces. "Used to be worse," Micah said. "Much worse," Jonah confirmed. By midday, they'd made enough progress that the barn felt almost stable. Not good, but stable enough to last the winter if they were lucky. They were taking a break, passing around a canteen of water, when Finn appeared in the doorway. "Father needs you," he said to Jonah. "Someone's here." The way he said it made Mara's instincts prickle, not excited, not neutral, worried. They walked back to the house together, Jonah's posture going tense and alert. 3 horses were tied at the rail. Expensive horses. Well-fed, well-groomed, the kind that cost more money than most frontier families saw in a year. Inside the house, Cade stood facing 3 men in the main room. 2 were clearly hired muscle, thick-built men with guns worn easy and eyes that tracked movement like predators. The third was something else entirely. Tall, well-dressed in clothes too clean for ranch country. 50 years old, maybe, with silver threading through dark hair and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just being neighborly," he was saying as Mara and the boys entered. "Checking in. Making sure you're managing all right out here with winter coming on." "We're managing," Cade said, voice flat. "Are you?" The man's eyes drifted around the room, taking in the patched walls and worn furniture and the general sense of barely holding together. "Because from what I hear, you've had a hard couple of years. Lost your wife, lost cattle, behind on your banknotes." "My business is my business, Boon." So this was Silas Boon. Mara had heard the name in town when she'd passed through. Wealthy cattle baron, owned half the valley. The kind of man who smiled while destroying people and called it progress. Boon's gaze landed on Mara. "And who's this? New hire?" "Cook," Cade said shortly. "Really?" Boon's smile widened slightly. "Didn't know you could afford to hire anyone, Mercer. Times must be better than I thought." "What do you want, Boon?" "I told you. Just being neighborly." He pulled a paper from his coat pocket and set it on the table. "But since you mention it, I've been authorized by the bank to make you an offer. Purchase price for Black Hollow Ranch. Very fair. More than fair, considering current circumstances." "Not interested." "You haven't even looked at the number." "Don't need to. Ranch isn't for sale. Ranch isn't—" Boone's smile never wavered, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Mercer, be reasonable. You can't keep this place running. You're drowning in debt. You've got 6 boys to feed and winter coming. Take the offer. Walk away with enough money to start over somewhere easier." "Somewhere you don't own, you mean?" "I own most of the valley. That's just good business." Boon picked up the paper and tucked it back in his coat. But I'm a patient man. Think about it. Talk to your boys. Maybe talk to your new cook here about what happens when stubborn men refuse good offers and their families suffer for it. He headed for the door, his 2 men falling in behind him. At the threshold, he paused and looked back.
Winter's going to be hard this year, Mercer. Real hard. Be a shame if you lost everything trying to prove a point. Then they were gone, riding away on those expensive horses, leaving silence behind them that felt heavy enough to suffocate. Cade stood motionless, staring at the door. "Father?" Jonah's voice was tight. "Not now." "But I said not now." Cade's voice cracked like a whip, and Jonah flinched back. Mara watched this play out and understood exactly what was happening. Boon hadn't come to make an offer. He'd come to apply pressure, to remind Cade that he was cornered and weak and running out of options. It was a tactic she'd seen before in mining camps and cattle towns, powerful men pushing desperate people until they broke. Cade walked out without another word, heading toward the barn, leaving the boys standing in uncomfortable silence. "He's going to sell," Micah said flatly. "We're going to lose the ranch." "He didn't say that," Jonah started. "He didn't have to. You saw his face." "What does that mean?" Eli asked, voice small. "Where will we go?" Nobody answered him because nobody had an answer. Mara felt that dangerous crack in her chest widening again, and before she could stop herself, she heard herself say, "He's not going to sell." All eyes turned to her. "How do you know?" Jonah demanded. "Because I've seen men like Boon before. They think they can break people by pushing hard enough. But your father's already broken. He's got nothing left to lose, and that makes him more dangerous than Boon realizes." "That doesn't mean he won't sell the ranch to keep us fed," Jonah said bitterly. "Maybe, but not today. Today he's angry, and angry is better than defeated." She didn't know if she believed that. Didn't know if any of them believed it, but sometimes belief wasn't the point. Sometimes you just needed words to fill the silence until you figured out what to do next. That night at dinner, Cade barely spoke. Ate mechanically, like food was just fuel and taste didn't matter. The boys picked at their plates, appetite killed by tension. Afterward, Mara found herself standing outside in the cold dark, looking at the empty land stretching away in all directions. This place was dying. She'd known it the moment she arrived, but somehow between the cooking and cleaning and talking to boys who'd forgotten how to hope, she'd stopped seeing it as someone else's problem. Footsteps behind her. She didn't turn. "You should leave tomorrow," Cade said quietly, "before this gets ugly." "Thought I had 3 days." "That was before Boon showed up. He's going to push harder now. Things are going to get dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Cade was quiet for a long moment. "You know how." She did. Fence cutting, cattle disappearing, equipment breaking in suspicious ways, hired men starting fights. All the small violences that happened when powerful people wanted something and weren't going to take no for an answer. "So what are you going to do?" Mara asked. "What can I do? I'm one man with 6 kids and no money. Boon owns the bank, owns half the ranchers in the valley. If he wants this land, he'll get it eventually." "Then why not sell?" "Because my wife is buried on this land." His voice went raw. "Right over that hill, under the oak tree, where she said the light was prettiest in the morning. I'm not letting Boon tear up her grave to run cattle across it." Mara turned to look at him then. In the darkness, he looked older than 40. Looked like a man who'd been carrying too much weight for too long and was starting to buckle under it. "Your boys are scared," she said carefully. "I know. They think you're going to give up." "Maybe I should." "But you won't." "No." He said it like a confession. "I won't. Even though I probably should. Even though staying might destroy us worse than leaving. I can't let him win." Pride, Mara thought. The kind of pride that got people killed on the frontier when being smart meant knowing when to fold. But she understood it anyway. 3 days, she said. "I'll stay the 3 days like I promised. After that," she trailed off, not sure how to finish. "After that you run," Cade said. "Far and fast. Don't look back." It was good advice, the kind she'd followed her entire life. But standing there in the cold darkness, listening to the wind move through empty spaces, and thinking about Eli's face when she'd told him she was leaving, Mara wasn't sure she could take it this time. The 3rd day started with screaming. Mara woke to the sound of Micah's voice raised in anger and Jonah shouting back and the crash of something breaking.
She was out of bed and through the door before full consciousness caught up with instinct. The two boys were in the main room, facing off like fighting dogs. Daniel and Samuel pressed against the far wall, eyes wide. Finn stood frozen near the fireplace. Eli had disappeared entirely. "Your fault we're in this mess," Micah was shouting. "How is any of this my fault?" Jonah fired back. "You're the oldest. You're supposed to take care of things. Instead, everything's falling apart." "I'm 16 years old. What do you want from me?" "I want you to fix it. I want you to make it better. I want—" Micah's voice cracked and his hands clenched into fists, and Mara saw with sudden clarity that this wasn't about Jonah at all. This was about a 14-year-old boy who'd been holding rage and fear inside for too long and didn't know what to do with it anymore. "Enough," she said, voice sharp enough to cut through the shouting. Both boys turned to stare at her. "Outside, both of you. Now." "This isn't your business," Micah started. "I said outside." Something in her tone killed the argument. They went, shoulders stiff with barely contained violence. Mara followed them out into the gray morning. Frost covered everything again. The air smelled like snow that hadn't fallen yet, and wood smoke from neighboring ranches too far away to see. "Start talking," she said. "What's this really about?" Silence. "Micah, you first." He kicked at the frozen dirt. "Nothing. It's stupid. Try me." More silence. Then, "I heard Father talking to one of the ranch hands last night. Said we might have to let them go. Can't afford to pay anymore. And if we can't keep the hands, we can't manage the herd. And if we can't manage the herd—" He didn't finish. "So you decided to pick a fight with your brother." "I wasn't picking a fight." "Yes, you were. Because fighting feels better than being scared. I get it." Mara looked at Jonah. "And you?" "I don't know what he wants from me," Jonah said, voice tight. "I'm doing everything I can, working every day until I can barely stand, trying to keep everyone together, trying to be—" He stopped. "Trying to be your father," Mara finished. "Someone has to." "No, someone has to be Jonah. Your father has to be your father. Those are different jobs." "Well, he's not doing a great job of it right now, is he?" "Fair point." Kate had been distant and distracted and barely present since Boon's visit, like he was already half gone even though he was still physically here. "Listen to me," Mara said, looking between both boys. "This ranch is in trouble. Bad trouble. I'm not going to lie to you about that, but tearing each other apart isn't going to help. You want to be angry? Fine. Be angry at Boon. Be angry at the bank. Be angry at bad luck and drought and everything else that's trying to crush you. But don't be angry at each other. That's exactly what Boon wants. He wants you divided, scared, turning on each other. Because families that fight themselves are easy to destroy. So what are we supposed to do? Micah demanded. Just smile and pretend everything's fine? No, you're supposed to work together. Figure out what you can control and control it. Fix what can be fixed. Let go of what can't. She was talking as much to herself as to them. And stop waiting for someone to save you. That's not how survival works. You sound like you know, Jonah said quietly. I do. How? Mara looked at these two boys, angry and scared and trying so hard to be strong, and made a decision she probably shouldn't have made. I grew up in a mining camp in Colorado, she said. Father drank. Mother died when I was 8. I had 2 younger sisters. Camp foreman decided we were easy targets, so I took my sisters and ran. I was 12 years old. Both boys had gone very still, listening. We survived 4 years on our own, Mara continued, working odd jobs, stealing when we had to, moving from place to place. Then there was a fever outbreak. Both my sisters died within 3 days of each other. I was 16, completely alone, and I had 2 choices, give up and die, or figure out how to keep living. Which one did you choose? Eli's voice came from behind her, small and frightened. She turned. He was standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, tears streaking his face. I chose to live, Mara said, even when I didn't want to, even when it hurt, because that's what survivors do. We keep going. Are we going to die? Eli whispered. No. How do you know? Because I'm not going to let you. The words came out before she thought them through, before she realized what she was promising, before she understood that she'd just made a commitment that went far beyond 3 days. The boys stared at her, Even Jonah looked stunned. "You're leaving tomorrow," Micah said. "You said so." "I know what I said." "So that was a lie?" "No, it was what I believed when I said it." Mara took a breath. "But things change, plans change, and I'm changing mine." "Why?" Jonah's voice was almost hostile. "What's in it for you?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing. This place is a disaster, and you're all half feral, and your father is drowning, and Boon is going to make life hell for anyone who tries to help you." She smiled without humor. "But I'm tired of running, and if I'm going to stop running, might as well be here." "That's crazy," Micah said. "Probably. Father can't pay you." "I know. So you're going to work for free? Live in a broken house with 6 kids you don't even know? Fight a cattle baron who destroys anyone who gets in his way?" Jonah was listing these things like he was trying to make her see reason. "That about sums it up, yes." "Why?" Mara looked at Eli, still wrapped in that blanket, tears drying on his face, hope starting to kindle behind the fear. "Because someone stayed for me once," she said quietly. "Long time ago. Didn't last. But while it did, it mattered. So maybe it's my turn to be the one who stays." Silence stretched out between them, broken only by wind and distant cattle and the creak of old wood settling. Then Eli dropped the blanket and ran to her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and held on like he was drowning, and she was the only solid thing left in the world. And Mara, who hadn't let anyone hold her in years, who'd built walls specifically to prevent moments like this, found herself holding him back. "You mean it?" Eli mumbled against her coat. "You're really staying?" "I really am." "Promise?" Mara closed her eyes. "I promise." When she opened them again, Jonah was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not trust. Not yet. But maybe the beginning of belief that trust might be possible. "We should tell Father," he said finally. "Probably." None of them moved for a long moment. Then Micah cleared his throat awkwardly and muttered, "Thanks." It wasn't much, but it was something. They found Cade in the barn, working on fence repairs with movements that looked mechanical and exhausted. He glanced up when they entered, took in the group of them standing there, and went back to hammering without comment. "Father," Jonah said. "Mara's staying." Cade's hammer paused mid-swing. "What?" "I'm staying," Mara confirmed. "Past the 3 days. Indefinitely." He turned to face her fully. "No." "Excuse me?" "I said no. You're leaving tomorrow like we agreed. I'm changing the agreement. You can't just—" He stopped, jaw working. "Look, I appreciate what you've done here. Boys are cleaner, house is cleaner, food is better, but you don't understand what you're signing up for. Boon is going to come back. And when he does, things are going to get ugly. People are going to get hurt. I won't have you caught in that." "Little late for that," Mara said. "I'm already caught." "You don't owe us anything." "I know I don't owe you anything. I'm not doing this because I owe you. I'm doing it because I want to." "Why?" The same question Jonah had asked, but coming from Cade, it sounded more like desperation. Mara looked at this exhausted man trying to protect her from his own disaster, and felt something shift in her chest. Not attraction, exactly, but recognition. The same thing she'd felt that first night, one damaged person seeing another clearly. "Because you need help," she said simply. "And I happen to be good at surviving impossible situations, so we help each other. That's the deal. I can't pay you. Don't care. You'll have to work hard, harder than you've probably ever worked. Done that before too. And Boon will be a problem we deal with when he becomes a problem. Together." She crossed her arms. "Stop trying to talk me out of this, Mercer. I've made up my mind." He stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly, something that might have been relief flickered across his face. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he said finally. "Probably both." "Definitely both," Micah muttered, and several of the other boys made sounds that might have been agreement or laughter. Cade looked at his sons, all of them standing there in the barn doorway, and something in his expression cracked open. Not breaking, opening, like a man who'd been holding his breath for 14 months and was finally allowing himself to exhale. "All right," he said quietly. "If you're staying, we need to get serious about winter prep. We're already behind. Boon's going to push harder once he realizes we're not selling. And the banknote is due in 6 weeks, so we've got work to do and not much time to do it. Then we better get started, Mara said. And just like that, without ceremony or celebration, she stopped being temporary help and became part of something she'd spent her entire life avoiding. A family, broken, barely holding together, and headed for a war they probably couldn't win. But hers. The work started the next morning before sunrise and didn't stop until long after dark. Mara woke the boys at 4, which earned her groans and complaints until she reminded them that winter didn't care about their sleep schedule. They needed to preserve every vegetable left in the garden before the hard freeze came. Can what could be canned, store what could be stored, salt and smoke the last of the meat before it spoiled, repair every piece of equipment that was going to break the moment they needed it most. "This is insane," Micah muttered around noon, elbow deep in a barrel of brine while they packed down cabbage for sauerkraut. "We're working harder than we did when Ma was alive." "That's because your mother was one person doing the work of 6, Mara said, not looking up from the cucumbers she was slicing. "Now there's 7 of us, and we're still barely keeping up. Makes you think, doesn't it? Makes me think we should hire more help." "With what money?" Micah didn't have an answer for that. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of knives on cutting boards and water splashing into buckets filling the kitchen. Outside, Cade and the older boys were reinforcing the livestock shelters, hammering new boards over gaps, checking roof integrity, making sure nothing would collapse under snow weight. "Can I ask you something?" Micah said eventually, voice careful. "Sure." "That story you told about your sisters, was it true?" Mara's hand stilled on the cucumber. She'd known this question was coming, had been avoiding thinking about it since the moment she'd opened her mouth and let her past spill out like water from a broken dam. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. Wasn't your fault." "Still," Micah wiped his hands on his pants, leaving brine streaks. "Must have been hard, being alone like that." "It was what it was." Mara went back to cutting, faster now, trying to bury the conversation under motion. "You learned to manage. Is that why you know how to do all this stuff? The preserving and organizing and everything? You learn things when survival depends on it." He was quiet again, processing. Then, "Do you think we're going to make it? Really?" Mara looked at this 14-year-old boy with bruised knuckles and anger simmering under his skin and realized he wasn't asking about the winter. He was asking about everything, the ranch, the family, whether hope was worth holding on to or just another thing that would get taken away. "I think we're going to try," she said carefully. "And sometimes trying is all you've got." "That's not exactly a yes." "No, it's not." At least she was honest. Micah seemed to appreciate that more than empty reassurance. They finished the preserving work by late afternoon, arms aching, clothes soaked with brine and vegetable juice. The pantry now held rows of jars that looked almost professional, pickles and relish and preserved beans and applesauce made from the gnarled fruit Finn had salvaged from the dying orchard. It wasn't enough to carry them through a hard winter, but it was more than they'd had yesterday. Small victories. That's what survival was built on. That evening at dinner, Cade laid out a map on the cleared table. It was hand-drawn on butcher paper, showing the ranch boundaries and the surrounding properties in rough detail. "Boon owns this section now," he said, pointing to the North Range. "Bought it from the Hendersons last spring after their well went dry. And this section here to the east, he got from the Pratts when their oldest boy died and they couldn't manage alone. So he's been circling us for a while," Jonah said. "Over a year, buying up everything around us. Now we're an island in territory he controls." Cade traced a finger along their southern border. "This is the only route to town that doesn't cross Boon's land. But come winter, this road washes out, gets impassable, which means we're effectively cut off from supplies for 3, maybe 4 months." Mara leaned over the map, studying the terrain. "What about water? 3 springs on the property. 2 are reliable. 3rd one's been drying up the last few years. And grazing? Decent enough if we manage the herd right. But we lost 40 head to rustlers last month, down to maybe 200 cattle total. That's not enough to turn a profit, even if we could get them to market." "Can't get them to market anyway," Jonah added bitterly. "Boon controls the rail yards. He'll block us out of spite, even if we had cattle to sell." The picture Cade was painting was grim. They were surrounded, outmaneuvered, running out of options and time. "So what's the plan?" Mara asked. Cade looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "Plan?" "Yes, plan. You're not actually planning to just sit here and wait for Boon to strangle you slowly, are you?" "What else can I do?" "He controls everything. The bank, the rail yards, half the valley. If I try to move cattle, he blocks me. If I try to borrow money, the bank refuses. If I fight back..." He didn't finish, but the implication was clear. People who fought Boon ended up broken or dead. Mara stared at the map, mind working through possibilities. There had to be an angle. There was always an angle if you looked hard enough. "What if we stopped playing his game?" she said slowly. "What do you mean?" "Boone's strategy works because he controls the cattle trade. Everything in this valley runs on beef, breeding, selling, shipping. That's where the money is. That's where the power is." "And?" Jonah was watching her now, interested despite himself. "And what if we stopped depending on cattle entirely?" The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. "That's suicide," Cade said flatly. "This is ranching country. You can't ranch without cattle. I'm not saying give up cattle completely. I'm saying diversify. Become less dependent on the one thing Boone can control." Mara pointed to the western section of the map. "What's this land here?" "Alkali flats mostly. Not good for grazing. We don't use it for anything." "Could you farm it?" "Farm?" Cade said the word like it tasted bad. "We're ranchers, not farmers." "Ranchers starve when the cattle baron cuts them off from markets," Mara countered. "Farmers eat regardless." "You're talking about growing crops. In this climate, on land that barely supports grass." He shook his head. "It won't work. Maybe not cash crops, but root vegetables, potatoes, turnips, carrots, things that store well through winter, things people need when supply lines get cut by snow and everyone's running out of food." "Nobody around here farms on that scale," Jonah said, but he sounded thoughtful rather than dismissive. "It's considered beneath ranchers, which is exactly why it might work. Boone won't see it coming because he's thinking like a rancher. He's expecting you to fight him on cattle. But if you shift the ground under his feet..." Mara traced a finger along the unused western section. "How many people live within a day's ride of here?" Cade thought about it. "Maybe 300 families spread across the valley and surrounding settlements. And come February, when the roads are frozen and the rail yards are snowed in and people are running low on preserved food, where are they going to go?" Understanding dawned slowly across Cade's face. "Here." "Here," Mara confirmed. "If we can build up enough supply, we become the valley's winter food source. Not for luxury, for survival. And people pay whatever they have to for survival." "That's actually brilliant," Micah said, sounding surprised. "It's risky," Jonah corrected. "We'd have to divert resources from cattle operations. We'd have to work land we've never worked before. And there's no guarantee it would produce enough to matter." "Everything's risky," Mara said. "Question is whether you want to take a risk that might save you or play it safe and definitely lose." Cade stared at the map for a long time, jaw working. She could see him turning it over in his mind, looking for holes, testing the logic against reality. Finally, he looked up. "We'd need seed, tools, labor, and we'd need to start immediately if we want anything planted before the ground freezes completely." "So we start immediately," Mara said. "It's crazy." "Probably. Most good ideas are." Something that might have been a smile flickered at the corner of Cade's mouth. The first real smile she'd seen from him since she arrived. "All right," he said. "We'll try it. But if this doesn't work..." "If it doesn't work, we're no worse off than we are now," Mara interrupted. "At least we'll go down fighting instead of waiting." Cade nodded slowly, and around the table the boys were sitting straighter, leaning in, the defeated slump in their shoulders replaced by something that looked almost like hope. It was fragile. It was probably foolish, but it was better than the hollow-eyed acceptance she'd seen when she first arrived. The next morning, they started transforming the alkali flats into farmland, and it was brutal work from the first shovel of dirt. The ground was hard and alkaline and full of rocks that seemed to multiply every time you cleared a section. They worked in shifts, Cade and Jonah breaking ground with the plow, Micah and Daniel following behind to rake out stones, Samuel and Finn hauling water to test soil saturation, Eli running messages between groups, and generally trying to be useful. Mara split her time between coordinating the farm work and keeping the house running, which meant she was working roughly 18 hours a day and sleeping in 4-hour chunks when exhaustion finally dragged her under. 2 days into the project, one of the plow blades broke, and they lost half a day to repairs. 3 days in, they discovered an entire section of ground was too saturated with alkali to support anything and had to shift their focus to a different area. 4 days in, Micah and Jonah got into another fight about the best way to break ground, and Mara had to physically step between them before it turned into actual violence. "You're both wrong," she said flatly when they finally stopped shouting. "The ground's too hard for your method, Jonah, and too rocky for yours, Micah. We need to water it first, let it soften overnight, then break it at dawn before it bakes hard again." They both stared at her. "How do you know that?" Jonah demanded. "Because I've done it before. Mining camp in Nevada. They made us clear ground for a vegetable garden using nothing but hand tools. Learned real fast what worked and what wasted energy." She walked away before either of them could argue, leaving them standing there looking chastened. By the end of the first week, they'd cleared and prepared roughly 3 acres. It wasn't enough. They needed at least double that to produce the kind of volume Mara's plan required. But 3 acres was better than nothing. They planted potatoes first, the most reliable crop for harsh conditions. Then turnips, rutabagas, winter squash, anything that could handle cold and store through extended periods. Seeds came from town, purchased on credit they probably couldn't afford but needed anyway. The boys complained constantly. Too much work, too little sleep, hands blistered and backs aching and muscles screaming from dawn to dusk. But they didn't quit. Even Finn, who barely spoke on good days, threw himself into the work with grim determination. "You all right?" Mara asked him one evening when they were hauling water together to irrigate the newly planted sections. He shrugged, which seemed to be his primary form of communication. "You've been working hard, harder than the others even." Another shrug. "Finn." She stopped walking, set down her bucket. "Talk to me." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw exhaustion in his eyes that went deeper than physical labor. "If we lose the ranch," he said quietly, voice rusty from disuse, "we'll get split up." "What?" "Father can't take care of all 6 of us if we lose everything. We'll end up in different places, orphanages maybe, or relatives we barely know." He picked up his bucket again, started walking. "So I'm working hard, because if this is our only chance to stay together, I'm not going to be the one who fails." Mara watched him go, something tight forming in her chest again. These boys had already lost their mother. The idea of losing each other on top of that was breaking them in ways that didn't show on the surface. She found Cade later that evening, sitting on the porch in the dark, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and staring at nothing. "Finn told me something today," she said, sitting down beside him without asking permission. "Yeah?" "Said he's scared you'll have to split up the boys if the ranch fails." Cade was quiet for a long moment. "He's not wrong." "You'd really do that?" "What choice would I have? I can't feed 6 kids if I've got no land and no income. At least if they're with relatives, they'd eat regularly. Have roofs over their heads, maybe even go to school. They'd be miserable. Maybe, but they'd be alive." Mara turned to look at him in the darkness. "Is that really the choice you want to make? Survival versus happiness?" "Sometimes survival is all you get. Happiness is a luxury for people who aren't drowning." She recognized the bitterness in his voice because she'd felt it herself for years. The exhaustion of constantly fighting just to stay above water. The slow erosion of hope until all that was left was the mechanical necessity of breathing in and out. "That's a bleak way to live," Mara said quietly. "It's the only way I know anymore." "What about before? Before your wife died? Were you different then?" Cade's hands tightened on the cigarette. "Used to be. Used to laugh. Used to think the ranch would be here for generations, that we'd build something permanent, something that mattered." He took a drag, exhaled slowly. "Then Catherine died, and everything just collapsed. And I realized how fragile it all was. How quickly good things disappear when you're not watching. So you stopped believing good things could last. Seemed safer that way." Mara understood that impulse, had lived by that philosophy herself for years. Don't get attached. Don't believe in permanence. Don't let yourself care too much because caring made losing hurt worse. But sitting here on this broken porch at this dying ranch with 6 boys sleeping inside who were counting on her to help save them,
She was starting to think maybe that philosophy was just another way of giving up. "What if we win?" she asked suddenly. Cade looked at her. "What? What if this crazy plan works? What if we make it through the winter? What if Boon doesn't destroy us? What then?" "Then we deal with whatever comes next." "But would you let yourself be happy, or would you just keep waiting for the next disaster?" He didn't answer, just sat there smoking and staring at the darkness like it might hold answers that refused to come in daylight. Eventually Mara stood up, brushed dirt from her skirt, and headed back inside. But before she reached the door, Cade's voice stopped her. "Mara?" "Yeah?" "Thank you. For staying. For giving a damn when you didn't have to." She wanted to say something meaningful, something that acknowledged the weight of what they were trying to build here. But words felt inadequate, so she just nodded and went inside. 2 weeks after they started planting, the first real snow came. Not the light flurries that had been teasing them for days. Actual snow. Heavy and thick and relentless, falling from a sky that had gone the color of old lead. They worked through it anyway, racing to get the last of the winter squash planted before the ground froze completely. Mara moved through the field like a ghost, dress soaked through, fingers numb, planting seedlings with mechanical precision while snow accumulated in her hair. "We need to stop," Jonah called out, barely audible over the wind. "It's not safe." "We're almost done," Mara shouted back. "You're going to freeze to death." "Then I'll freeze. Keep planting." They finished as darkness fell, stumbling back to the house half frozen and completely exhausted. Mara's hand shook so badly she couldn't work the buttons on her coat. Cade had to help her, fingers careful on the frozen fabric, face creased with concern. "You pushed too hard," he said. "Had to finish." "You almost killed yourself finishing." "Almost doesn't count." He made a sound that was half frustration, half something else. "You're as stubborn as my wife was." "I'm taking that as a compliment." It wasn't meant as one. But he smiled when he said it, small and brief and genuine, and Mara felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire Daniel was building in the hearth. The boys crashed hard that night, falling asleep before dinner was even ready. Mara had to wake them to eat, then watch them stagger to their beds like walking dead. Only Eli fought sleep, curled up next to Mara on the worn sofa with his head on her shoulder. "You're not going to leave, right?" he mumbled, words slurred with exhaustion. "Even though it's hard?" "I'm not leaving." "Promise?" "I promise." He was asleep before she finished speaking, his small body going heavy against her side. Mara sat there holding him while the fire burned low and snow piled up outside, thinking about promises and permanence and all the ways life could break people who cared too much. She should be terrified. She'd just committed herself to an impossible situation with no guarantee of success and every reason to expect failure. But instead she felt something she hadn't felt in years, like she belonged somewhere, like she mattered, like she was home. The snow stopped 2 days later, leaving the valley transformed into something alien and beautiful. White stretched in every direction, broken only by fence posts and the dark shapes of buildings standing stark against brightness. They spent those days in the house, going stir-crazy from confinement but grateful for the rest. Mara used the time to teach the boys things they should have learned years ago: how to darn socks properly, how to maintain tools so they'd last, how to ration food when supplies ran low. Jonah absorbed everything like a sponge, asking questions, making notes in a little book he kept in his shirt pocket. Micah pretended not to pay attention, but she caught him practicing knots when he thought no one was watching. Even Finn participated, sitting close enough to see, but not so close as to draw attention to himself. When the weather cleared and they could finally go outside, they discovered 2 problems immediately. First, one of the irrigation channels had frozen and cracked, which meant they'd have to repair it before the next thaw or risk flooding. Second, someone had cut their fence line during the storm. Not weather damage, cut. Clean slices through wire that could only have been made by someone with tools and intention. Cade stood looking at the damage, face gone hard as stone. "Boon." "Could have been anyone," Jonah said, but he didn't sound convinced. "No, this is him, reminding us he's watching, that he can hurt us whenever he wants." "What do we do?" Daniel asked, voice small. Cade looked at his sons, then at Mara, and she saw him making calculations. Fight back and escalate. Report it and accomplish nothing because Boon owned the law.
or swallow the insult and fix it themselves. We repair the fence, he said finally, and we don't give him the satisfaction of reacting. They worked in silence, stretching new wire, replacing posts, making everything secure again. But the damage had been done in more than just the physical sense. Everyone was looking over their shoulders now, waiting for the next attack. It came 3 days later. Mara woke to Micah pounding on her door, voice urgent. Something's wrong with the cattle. She was dressed and outside in under 2 minutes, following him through pre-dawn darkness to the main pasture. 24 head were down. Not dead, but sick. Staggering, foaming at the mouth, eyes rolling white with panic. Poison, Cade said, crouched beside one of the fallen animals. His voice was flat, empty. The voice of a man who'd been hit too many times to react with anger anymore. How? Jonah demanded. Water trough, probably. Someone dumped something in during the night. Can we save them? Samuel asked. Cade shook his head. Too far gone. Best we can do is put them down before they suffer more. The shooting took an hour. 23 cattle total, executed methodically while the boys watched with expressions ranging from horror to rage to something that looked like defeat. When it was done, they stood in the pasture surrounded by death and tried to calculate the damage. That's 10% of the herd, Jonah said numbly. Gone in one night. Boon's sending a message, Mara said, voice hard. He wants you scared. It's working, Micah muttered. No. She turned to face them all. It's not working, because scared would be giving up. This is just making me angry. Angry doesn't help when he can destroy us piece by piece and we can't do anything about it, Jonah said bitterly. We can do something. We can refuse to quit. We can keep building what we're building. Mara pointed back toward the house. We've got 3 acres planted. Enough preserved food to last the winter if we're careful. A house that's cleaner than it's been in over a year. You've got each other. That's more than most people have. So yes, Boon killed some cattle. Yes, it hurts. But it doesn't destroy us unless we let it. She's right, Cade said quietly. All eyes turned to him. I've been waiting to lose everything for so long I forgot we could still fight. But Mara's right. We're not dead yet, and as long as we're breathing, we keep going. Something shifted in the air, not hope exactly, but determination, the kind born from being pushed past the point of fear into something harder and more durable. They spent the rest of that day butchering the dead cattle for meat. It was gruesome work, but practical. If Boon was going to kill their livestock, they'd at least salvage what they could. By evening, the smokehouse was full, and they had enough salted beef to supplement their winter supplies significantly. Small victories. That's what you built survival on. That night, Mara found Cade sitting at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring at a sheet of paper covered in numbers. Banknote? She asked. He nodded. Due in 3 weeks. I've been running the numbers every way I can think of. We're short, even with the cattle we've got left. Even if we could sell them tomorrow at full price, we'd still be short. How much? $200. Mara sat down across from him. $200 might as well be $2,000 for people in their situation. What happens if you can't pay? Bank forecloses. Boon probably has a deal with them already. He'll buy the ranch at auction for half what it's worth. We'll have 30 days to clear out. And then? Then I take what money I can scrape together and find places for the boys. Split them up among relatives who'll take them out of obligation, if not affection. His voice was hollow. And I go find work somewhere. Become a hired hand on someone else's land. Live in a bunkhouse. Grow old wondering if I could have done something different. Mara looked at this broken man laying out the blueprint of his own defeat and felt anger rise hot and sharp in her chest. No, she said firmly. Mara, I said no. We're not splitting up your boys. We're not losing the ranch. We're not giving Boon the satisfaction. There's no way to get $200 in 3 weeks. I've tried everything. Then we'll try something you haven't thought of yet. Like what? She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But sitting there in the kitchen while the clock ticked toward disaster, Mara made a decision that would change everything. Give me 2 days, she said. Don't make any decisions for 2 days. Promise me. Cade looked at her like she was insane. What are you going to do in 2 days? I don't know yet, but I'll figure something out. Mara, 2 days, Cade. That's all I'm asking. He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. 2 days. But after that, I have to face reality. Deal. She left him sitting there with his numbers and his defeat and went to her small room to think. 2 days to save a ranch, 2 days to find money they didn't have, 2 days to perform a miracle. Mara sat on the edge of her cot and stared at her 2 carpet bags in the corner, everything she owned in the world still packed and ready to run. She could leave. Right now. Walk away before this whole situation collapsed and took her down with it. That would be smart, safe. But she'd promised Eli she would stay, promised Cade she'd help, promised herself she was done running. So she sat there in the darkness, thinking about mining camps and survival skills, and all the desperate things she'd learned to do when regular options didn't exist. And slowly, dangerously, a plan began to form. It was risky, possibly illegal. Definitely not something she wanted the boys to know about. But it might work. And sometimes might was all you had. Mara left the ranch before dawn the next morning while everyone was still asleep. She took one of the horses, the older mare that wouldn't be missed for a day, and rode toward town with the kind of purpose that came from having no other options. The plan forming in her head was dangerous, the kind of thing that could land her in jail if it went wrong. But desperation made people do things they'd never consider otherwise, and right now desperation was the only currency she had. Town was 8 miles away, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence along a muddy main street. The general store, the saloon, the bank that held Cade's debt like a noose. And at the far end, half hidden behind the livery stable, a small establishment with no sign that everyone called Murphy's. Murphy's was where miners and ranch hands went to play cards when they had money burning holes in their pockets. Where fortunes changed hands over poker and dice and games that weren't quite legal but weren't quite stopped either. Mara had worked in places like Murphy's before, serving drinks and watching men lose their wages with the kind of inevitability that came from desperation mixed with hope. But she'd also learned to play, not because she enjoyed gambling, because survival sometimes required taking calculated risks, and knowing how to read people across a card table was just another skill like preserving food or fixing pumps. She tied the horse behind the livery and walked to Murphy's back entrance, knocking 3 times the way she'd learned years ago in Colorado. A slot opened, eyes appeared. Yeah? I need to see Murphy. Murphy don't see people before noon. Tell him Mara Vale is here, from the Silverton games. He'll remember. The slot closed. Mara waited, trying to ignore the voice in her head screaming that this was a mistake. The door opened. Murphy looked older than she remembered, more gray in his beard, more lines around his eyes. But his gaze was sharp as ever, evaluating her in the space of 2 seconds. Mara Vale, he said slowly. Heard you were dead. Not yet. Close enough, from the look of you. He stepped aside. Come in. The interior of Murphy's hadn't changed. Dark, smoky, smelling like whiskey and old cigars and the particular desperation of men trying to win back what they'd already lost. Empty now, except for Murphy and a bartender washing glasses. You here to play or cause trouble? Murphy asked, sitting at a corner table and gesturing for her to join him. Play. You got money? I will after I play. He laughed, but it wasn't a kind sound. That's not how gambling works. It is if you're good enough. Mara met his eyes. I need $200 by the end of tomorrow. I'm willing to risk everything I have to get it. Everything you have looks like about $10 and some lint. $12. And I'm better than most people who walk through that door? Better how? I can count cards, read tells, calculate odds faster than drunk cowboys can blink. She leaned forward. Put me at a table tonight. High stakes. I'll win enough to pay the house percentage and walk away with what I need. Murphy studied her for a long moment. And if you lose? Then I lose. But I won't. Confidence is expensive when you're wrong. I'm not wrong. He pulled out a pipe, took his time filling it, lighting it, taking a few draws. Why do you need $200 that bad? Does it matter? It does if you're planning to lose it at my tables and then cause problems when you can't pay. Mara considered lying, then decided the truth was faster. Ranch I'm working for is about to go under. Banknote due in 3 weeks. 200 short. If we can't pay, 6 kids get split up and sent to relatives who don't want them. So yes, I need it that bad.
Murphy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that might have been memory or sympathy or just recognition of familiar desperation. "The Mercer place?" he asked. "You know it?"
No, Cade Mercer. Good man. Bad luck. Murphy puffed his pipe. Also know Silas Boon's been trying to force him out for over a year. So you're not just gambling for money, you're gambling against Boon by proxy. Does that change anything? Makes it more interesting. He stood up. All right, be here at 8 tonight. I'll get you a seat at the high-stakes table. But understand something. The men who play at that table aren't drunk cowboys. They're serious players with serious money and serious tempers. You cheat, you die. You win too much too fast, you die. You cause problems, you die. Clear? Clear. And if you can't cover your losses, I take whatever you've got and we're done. No second chances. Understood.
Murphy walked her to the door. Before opening it, he said quietly, "For what it's worth, I hope you pull this off. Boone's a bastard. Seeing someone stick it to him would be worth the entertainment value alone." Then he led her out into the cold morning air, and Mara walked back to the horse wondering if she'd just made the best decision of her life or signed her own death warrant.
She made it back to the ranch by mid-morning. Cade was in the barn, and from his expression when he saw her, he'd noticed her absence. "Where were you?" "Not angry, just tired." "Town." "Why?" "Had something to take care of." "What kind of something?" Mara met his eyes. "The kind you're better off not knowing about. Trust me." She could see him wanting to push, wanting answers, but something in her face must have convinced him to let it go because he just nodded slowly. "You all right?" he asked instead. "I will be, one way or another." She spent the rest of the day in a haze of nervous energy, helping with chores but unable to focus properly. Eli kept asking if she was sick. Jonah watched her with suspicion. Even Finn seemed to notice something was off. "I'm fine," she told them repeatedly. "Just tired." By evening, she couldn't pretend anymore. She pulled Cade aside while the boys were washing up for dinner. "I need to go back to town tonight," she said quietly. "I'll be back by morning." "Mara, what's going on?" "I'm trying to fix something. That's all I can tell you." "Fix what?" "The money problem." His face went still. "How?" "Better you don't know. If it works, we'll have what we need. If it doesn't—" She didn't finish. Cade grabbed her arm, not hard but firm. "Don't do anything illegal. Whatever you're planning, it's not worth going to jail for." "I'm not planning anything illegal." "Technically true. Gambling wasn't illegal, just frowned upon. But I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" He searched her face for a long moment. Then, slowly, he released her arm and nodded. "I trust you, but if you're not back by dawn, I'm coming looking." "I'll be back." She left after dinner, this time telling the boys she needed to check on something in town and would return late. Eli clung to her leg, making her promise she wasn't leaving for good. "Just overnight," she assured him. "I'll be back before you wake up." The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. If she told them what she was really doing, they'd either try to stop her or worry themselves sick. Better they thought she was running errands. Murphy's was crowded by the time she arrived, filled with the kind of men who had money and no sense of how to keep it. She slipped through the back entrance like Murphy had instructed, and he met her in the hallway. "Table's ready. 4 players besides you. 2 ranchers, 1 businessman from the rail yard, 1 professional gambler passing through. House minimum is $20. You got it?" Mara pulled out her $12 and added the small pocket watch she'd kept since Colorado, the only thing of value she still owned. "This is worth at least 10, probably 15 if you sell it right." Murphy examined the watch, then pocketed it. 22 in credit. Don't lose it in the first hand." The back room was smaller than the main floor, quieter, thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of serious money changing hands. The table held 5 chairs, 4 already occupied. Murphy made introductions. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Vale. She'll be joining tonight's game." The ranchers barely glanced at her. The businessman looked annoyed. The professional gambler, a thin man with calculating eyes and expensive clothes, smiled slightly. "A woman," he said. "How refreshing." "Dealer in or not?" Murphy asked. "By all means. Always happy to take money from fresh blood." Mara took her seat and tried to ignore the way her heart was hammering. This was it. No turning back now. They played poker. Texas Hold'em with $5 antes and no limit on raises. The kind of game where fortunes evaporated in single hands if you weren't careful. Mara played conservatively at first, folding bad hands, betting small on decent ones, losing slowly, but not catastrophically. She needed to establish herself as competent, but not threatening, someone the other players would underestimate. After an hour, she was down to $15 in credit. After 2 hours, she'd clawed back to 23. The professional gambler was winning most hands, playing with the kind of cold precision that came from years of reading people. The ranchers were losing steadily, getting frustrated, betting bigger to compensate. The businessman had already lost $40 and was starting to sweat. Mara watched, studied, learned their patterns. The first rancher bet big when he had nothing, trying to bluff his way to victory. The second rancher only stayed in hands when he had cards worth keeping. The businessman played emotionally, chasing losses like a man drowning. And the professional gambler was counting cards just like she was, keeping track of what had been played and calculating odds with machine-like accuracy. He was the real threat. 3 hours in, Mara got her first good hand. Pocket queens. The flop came Queen 7-3, giving her 3 of a kind. She bet conservatively, $10. The businessman folded. First rancher raised to 20. Second rancher folded. The professional gambler studied her for a long moment, then called. The turn card was a 5. First rancher checked. Mara bet 25. The professional gambler raised to 50. The rancher cursed and folded. Now it was just Mara and the gambler, and she had $73 in the pot against his 50. The river card was a 2. The gambler smiled slightly and pushed all his chips forward. $200. Mara's entire credit was $38. If she called and lost, she was done. But she had 3 queens. The board showed no possible straights or flushes. Unless he had pocket aces or pocket kings and hit trips on the river, she had him beat. The question was whether she believed her own read. "I need a minute," she said quietly. "Take your time," the gambler said pleasantly. "Though I should mention the house requires you to match or fold. No credit extensions." Meaning she couldn't call, not with what she had. Mara looked at her cards again, looked at the board, looked at the gambler's face, searching for any tell that might give away whether he was bluffing. Nothing. Perfect poker face. Then she saw it. Small thing. Barely noticeable. His left thumb rubbing against his middle finger in a slow, rhythmic pattern. She'd seen that gesture before in Colorado, from a gambler who did it when he was nervous. A self-soothing tell that meant uncertainty. He was bluffing. Or she was wrong and about to lose everything. "I'm all in," Mara said, pushing her chips forward. $38. That's what I've got." "House rules require matching the bet," Murphy said from the doorway. The gambler looked at Mara. "Can't cover 200? "No, but I can offer collateral for the difference." "What kind of collateral?" Mara pulled her mother's wedding ring from her pocket, the only piece of jewelry she'd kept through all the years of running. Gold band, thin and worn, with a tiny chip of diamond that probably wasn't worth much but was worth everything to her. "This? It's worth at least 100, probably more." The gambler looked at the ring, looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. "That's sentimental value," he said quietly. "Not actual value. It's gold. Real gold. Test it if you don't believe me." Murphy took the ring, examined it in the lamplight, bit down on it gently. "It's real." $150 for the ring," Mara said, "plus my 38 in chips. That's $188. $12 short of your 200, but it's everything I have." The room had gone silent. Even the players at other tables had stopped to watch. The gambler studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, he pushed his cards forward. "I fold." Mara blinked. "What?" "I fold. Take the pot." "But I said take it." He stood up. "You're a better player than you let on, Miss Vale, and that ring means more to you than winning this hand means to me. So take your money and get out before your luck changes." He walked away before she could respond, disappearing into the crowd. Mara sat frozen for a moment, staring at the pile of chips in the center of the table that were now hers. $73. Combined with her remaining 38, she had 111. Not enough. Murphy appeared at her shoulder. Smart fold on his part. He was holding Jack 10 suited. Had nothing. You would have won. "I'm still short," Mara said quietly. You could keep playing and risk losing what I have. That's how gambling works. Murphy paused. Or you could work for it. Work how? Deal for me. 3 nights. I'll pay you $30 a night. That's 90. Plus what you won tonight, you'd have enough. Mara turned to look at him. 3 nights of dealing gets me $90? My regular dealer quit last week. I'm desperate. You're competent. And you don't cheat, which is rarer than you'd think in this business. He shrugged. Take it or leave it. 3 nights meant 3 nights away from the ranch. 3 nights of the boys wondering where she was. 3 nights of Cade thinking she'd abandoned them. But it also meant $201, enough to save the ranch. Deal, Mara said. She worked those 3 nights like someone possessed, dealing cards with mechanical precision while her mind calculated everything she was missing back at Black Hollow Ranch. The boys needed supervision. The winter crops needed checking. Cade needed help managing everything. But $90 was $90. The first night passed without incident. Murphy paid her $30 in cash at sunrise, and she rode back to the ranch exhausted but determined. Cade was waiting on the porch. Where have you been? Not angry? Beyond angry. Straight to terrified. Working. Making money. Doing what? Dealing cards at Murphy's. He stared at her. You're gambling. I'm working. There's a difference. She held up the money. This is $30. I have 2 more nights, then we'll have enough to pay the bank note. Mara, don't. Just don't. I know what you're going to say. It's dangerous. It's risky. I should have told you, but I didn't because you would have tried to stop me, and we need this money more than we need your approval. Her words came out harsher than intended, sharpened by exhaustion and stress, and 3 nights of breathing smoke in rooms full of dangerous men. Cade's jaw worked. I wasn't going to stop you. I was going to say thank you. That caught her off guard. Oh, the boys have been asking about you. Eli thinks you left. I told him you were working, but he doesn't believe me. Guilt hit like a physical blow. I'll talk to him. You should sleep first. You look half dead. Can't. Need to check the crops. Need to... Mara. He caught her arm gently. Sleep. I'll handle everything for a few hours. You've earned it. She wanted to argue, but exhaustion was pulling at her like undertow, and the world was starting to blur at the edges. 2 hours, she mumbled. 4. 3. Deal. She made it to her room and collapsed onto the cot without bothering to remove her boots. Sleep took her under immediately, heavy and dreamless. When she woke, the sun was setting and someone had covered her with a blanket. Eli was sitting on the floor beside the cot, drawing pictures on a piece of slate. You came back, he said, when he noticed her eyes open. I told you I would. I didn't believe you. I know. I'm sorry. He set down the slate. Where do you go at night? Town. I'm working to earn money. Why? How did you explain financial desperation to a 6-year-old? So we can keep the ranch. Are we going to lose it? Mara sat up, ignoring her protesting muscles. Not if I can help it. Promise? I promise I'm going to try. That's the best I can do. He climbed onto the cot beside her and leaned against her shoulder the way he did when he needed reassurance. I don't want to leave. I like it here now. Ever since you came, it feels like home again. Something in Mara's chest cracked open wider, and she wrapped an arm around his small shoulders. I don't want you to leave either, she said quietly. They sat like that until Daniel came to call them for dinner, and Mara realized with startling clarity that she'd stopped thinking of this place as temporary somewhere along the way. This wasn't just a ranch she was trying to save. It was home. The second night at Murphy's was harder. Word had spread that a woman was dealing at the high-stakes table, and the room filled with men who wanted to see the novelty. Some were respectful. Others made comments that Murphy had to shut down with threats of expulsion. Mara dealt through it all with gritted teeth and focus that never wavered. $30 more by dawn. 171 total. 1 more night. She rode back to the ranch as the sun rose, body screaming for sleep, but mind too wired to rest properly. Cade met her at the barn. Last night? He asked. Last night. Then what? Then we pay the banknote. Save the ranch. Hope Boon doesn't find a new way to destroy us. And you? His voice was quiet. What happens to you after we're saved?
Mara hadn't let herself think that far ahead. I stay, if you'll have me. If I'll have you, he repeated, something unreadable in his expression. Mara, you've saved this family, saved this ranch, saved me. The question isn't whether I'll have you. The question is why you'd want to stay with a broken man and 6 half-feral boys in the middle of nowhere. Because broken people understand each other, she said simply. And nowhere feels like somewhere when the right people are there. He looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled. Actually smiled. Not the small, bitter expression she'd seen before, but something genuine. Then I guess you're stuck with us. Guess so. The third night started badly and got worse. Mara arrived at Murphy's to find 3 of Boon's men sitting at the bar, drinking and watching the tables with expressions that promised trouble. Murphy saw her face. Ignore them. They're here for the liquor, not the games. You sure about that? No, but we proceed anyway. She dealt for 4 hours without incident. The games ran smoothly. Money changed hands. She collected her tips and focused on getting through the night. Then one of Boon's men approached the table during a break between hands. You're Mara Vale, he said. Not a question. Do I know you? No, but I know you. You're working at the Mercer place, helping Cade try to save his failing ranch. He smiled unpleasantly. Mr. Boon wanted me to deliver a message. I'm not interested in messages from Boon. You should be. He knows what you're doing, knows you're trying to scrape together money for the banknote, and he wants you to know it won't matter. That right? That's right. See, Mr. Boon owns the bank, and even if you pay what's owed, he'll just call in the note early. Legal right to do it, buried in the contract Mercer signed years ago. The man leaned closer. So you're wasting your time, sweetheart. That ranch is going to be Boon's property one way or another. Question is whether you want to be there when it happens. Rage flooded through Mara so hot and sudden she had to clench her fist to keep from hitting him. Get away from my table, she said, voice low and dangerous. Or what? Or I break your nose with this deck of cards, and Murphy throws you out into the street. Murphy appeared beside them. She's not joking, and neither am I. You're done here. Out. The man smiled. Just delivering a message. Message delivered. Now leave. Boon's men left, but the damage was done. Everyone in the room had heard the exchange, and now everyone knew the ranch was still in danger even if Mara succeeded. She finished the night in a fog of fury and despair, collected her final $30, and walked out into the pre-dawn cold feeling hollowed out. $201 total. Enough to pay the banknote. Not enough to stop Boon if he decided to call in the debt early. She rode back to the ranch as the sun rose and found all 7 Mercers waiting for her in the main room. Cade stood when she entered. Did you get it? Mara pulled the money from her pocket and set it on the table. Bills and coins carefully counted. $201, exactly what we need. The boys erupted in celebration. Eli threw his arms around her. Micah actually smiled. Even Finn made a sound that might have been relief, but Cade was watching her face. What's wrong? Boon's men were at Murphy's tonight. Said even if we pay the note, Boon can call in the debt early. Something about it being in the contract. The celebration died immediately. Is that true? Jonah asked his father. Cade's face had gone gray. I'd have to check the paperwork, but if Boon says it's there, it probably is. So we're still going to lose the ranch, Daniel said quietly. No. Mara's voice came out harder than she intended. We're not. We're going to pay this note, and then we're going to find a way to stop Boon from calling in anything else. Because I didn't spend 3 nights dealing cards in a smoke-filled room just to hand him a victory. How? Micah demanded. If he controls the bank, then we find leverage. Something that makes it more expensive for him to push us than to leave us alone. People have been trying to find leverage on Boon for years, Cade said. He's too careful, too connected. Then we make him uncareful. We force mistakes. We turn his strength into weakness. Mara looked around the room at these people who'd become her family without her quite noticing. But first we pay this banknote. Show him we're not backing down. Then we figure out the rest. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was something. And sometimes something was enough to keep fighting. They rode to town together 3 days later, Cade, Mara, and Jonah. The banknote clutched in Cade's hand like a weapon. $200 in cash secured in Mara's saddlebag.
The bank manager looked surprised when they walked in. More surprised when Cade laid out the money in neat stacks on the counter. "Payment in full," Cade said. $200? Due today. The manager counted it slowly, twice, then stamped the note paid and handed Cade a receipt. "You're current," he said, but he didn't sound happy about it. "For now," Cade agreed. They walked out into the cold morning air, and for one brief moment, Mara let herself believe they'd actually won something. Then she saw Boon standing across the street, watching them with that smile that never reached his eyes. And she knew the real fight was only just beginning. Boon crossed the street toward them with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything in sight and knew it. His boots barely made sound on the frozen dirt, and that smile stayed fixed on his face like something painted there. "Mercer," he said pleasantly, "heard you managed to scrape together the bank payment. Congratulations." "We're current," Cade said flatly. "For now." Boon's gaze shifted to Mara. "And you must be the industrious Miss Vale. Working nights at Murphy's. Very enterprising." "Is there something you want, Boon?" Mara asked, keeping her voice level despite the anger simmering underneath. "Just wanted to commend you on your efforts. Really, it takes determination to deal cards for 3 nights to save a dying ranch." He pulled out a cigar, took his time lighting it. "But determination doesn't change mathematics. You're still drowning, Mercer. You're just drowning slower." "We'll manage," Cade said. "Will you?" Boon gestured vaguely at the town around them. "Winter's coming on hard, your herd's depleted, your land's marginal, at best. And I'm a patient man, but my patience isn't infinite." He took a draw on the cigar. "The offer still stands. Sell now, walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else. Keep fighting, and you'll lose everything." "We're not selling," Mara said before Cade could respond. Boone's smile widened slightly. "Interesting. The help speaks for the owner now." "I'm not help. I'm family." Something flickered in Boone's eyes. Not anger exactly, more like recognition that he'd misjudged the situation. "Family," he repeated. "How touching." "Well, Miss Vale, since you're family now, let me be clear about something. I've been acquiring land in this valley for 15 years. I own 70% of the grazing rights. I control the water. I have agreements with the rail yard. And I don't lose. Ever. So when I decide I want a piece of property, I get it. The only question is how much pain the current owner endures before accepting reality." "Maybe you've been winning because people are too scared to fight back," Mara said. "Maybe you're not as powerful as you think." Boon laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "You've got spirit. I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't pay banknotes or survive blizzards or stop accidents from happening to people who stand in my way." The threat was barely veiled, and Jonah took a step forward, fists clenching. Cade caught his arm. "We're done here," Cade said quietly. "Come on." They walked to their horses while Boon watched from the boardwalk, still smiling, still radiating that casual certainty that eventually everyone broke. They were a mile out of town before anyone spoke. "He's going to come after us harder now," Jonah said. "That wasn't a conversation. It was a warning." "Let him come," Mara said. "We'll be ready." "Ready how?" Jonah turned in his saddle to look at her. "He has money, men, power. What do we have?" "Each other," Cade said quietly. "And that's not nothing. It's also not enough. Then we make it enough." Mara kept her eyes on the road ahead. "Boon thinks he's invincible because everyone's too scared to organize against him. But what if we change that? What if we convince the other ranchers to stop fighting each other and start fighting him together?" "They won't," Cade said. "I've tried. Everyone's too worried about protecting their own property to care about anyone else's. That's because they think they can survive by keeping their heads down. We need to show them that Boone's coming for all of them eventually, that fighting together is the only way any of them survive." Jonah looked skeptical. "And how do we do that?" "I don't know yet," Mara admitted, "but we've got winter to figure it out." The first blizzard hit 2 weeks later with the kind of violence that made everything else seem irrelevant by comparison. Snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. Wind howled through gaps in walls they didn't know existed. Temperature dropped so fast the pump froze solid, and they had to melt snow for water. They'd prepared as well as they could, but preparation only went so far against nature trying to kill you. The livestock suffered worst. Despite the reinforced shelters, 3 cattle and 1 horse froze to death the first night.
By morning, the remaining animals were huddled together in a mass of body heat and terror, and getting them fed meant braving winds that cut like knives. Mara and the older boys took shifts every 2 hours, fighting through whiteout conditions to carry hay and break ice in the troughs. Cade wanted to do it himself, but Mara overruled him. "You're needed here managing everything else. Let us handle the animals." "I don't want you out there. I've survived worse," she cut him off. "And standing here arguing wastes time we don't have." She went out with Jonah into the storm, and within minutes understood why Cade had been worried. The cold didn't just hurt, it attacked, stealing breath from lungs, freezing exposed skin so fast you could feel flesh dying. Visibility disappeared completely within yards of the barn, and she had to hold on to a rope they'd strung between buildings just to keep from getting lost. They made it to the livestock shelter, got the animals fed, checked for injuries. One of the cows had frostbite on her ears. Another was showing signs of pneumonia. Not much they could do except keep them warm and hope. On the way back to the house, Jonah slipped on ice and went down hard. Mara grabbed him before the wind could push him off the path, hauling him back to his feet. "Thanks," he gasped, voice barely audible over the storm. "Stay close to me. Don't let go of the rope." They made it back to the house and collapsed inside, ice crusted on their clothes, faces numb. Daniel and Samuel immediately started helping them out of frozen coats, while Eli ran to get blankets. 2 more hours, Cade said. Then Micah and I go out. "This is insane," Micah muttered. "We're going to die out there." "Then we die," Mara said, teeth chattering. "But the livestock don't." The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of rotations every 2 hours. 3 days of fighting through wind and snow and cold that felt actively malicious. 3 days of exhaustion so deep they started hallucinating in the spaces between sleep and waking. But they kept the livestock alive. And more importantly, they kept each other alive. When the storm finally broke and the sun emerged like something forgotten, they stumbled outside to assess damage and found the world transformed into something alien. Snow had drifted against the buildings in waves 15 feet high. Fences were buried completely. The road to town had disappeared entirely. They were cut off, completely isolated, and winter had barely started. "How much food do we have?" Kate asked that night while they were all too exhausted to do anything but sit around the fire. Mara had been tracking supplies obsessively. "If we ration carefully, enough for 3 months. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. And after that? After that, we hope the road's clear and we can get to town for supplies. And if they don't clear?" Nobody wanted to answer that question. 2 weeks after the first blizzard, a second one hit. Not as violent, but longer, grinding on for 5 days straight. This time, they lost 6 cattle and had to butcher 2 more that were too injured to save. The meat helped supplement their dwindling supplies, but every loss was a financial blow they couldn't afford. During one of the brief breaks between storms, a rider appeared on the horizon. Jonah spotted him first, and they all tensed until they recognized Tom Henderson, one of the neighboring ranchers. Henderson looked rough, frostbitten face, thin to the point of gaunt, horse barely standing. "Need help," he said when Cade met him in the yard. "Wife's sick, fever. Can't get to town for medicine. Heard you had someone here who knew about surviving." He was looking at Mara. "How high's the fever?" she asked. "High enough she's not making sense when she talks." "How long?" 3 days. Mara exchanged glances with Cade. 3 days of high fever was bad, potentially fatal without proper treatment. "I can try," she said, "but I'm not a doctor." "Don't need a doctor. Need someone who's kept people alive in bad situations." Henderson's voice cracked slightly. "Please, she's all I got." They rode out together, Mara, Cade, and Henderson, leaving Jonah in charge with strict instructions to keep everyone inside and maintain the rotation for livestock care. The Henderson place was 3 miles away but took 2 hours to reach through snow that came up to the horses' chests. The house was small and cold, the fire nearly out, and Henderson's wife lay in bed shaking with fever that had burned through every blanket they owned. Mara recognized the signs immediately. Not just fever, infection, probably from a wound that had gotten dirty and turned septic. "Where's she hurt?" Mara asked. "Leg. Caught it on barbed wire a week ago. Seemed fine at first, then..." Mara pulled back the blankets and found the wound on Mrs. Henderson's left calf. Red, swollen, streaks of infection radiating outward toward the knee. Bad. Very bad. We need to clean this. Hot water, clean cloths, strongest whiskey you have. They worked for hours. Mara cleaned the wound with whiskey that made Mrs. Henderson scream even through the fever. Packed it with poultices made from herbs she'd learned about in mining camps. Yarrow to stop bleeding, golden seal for infection, comfrey to promote healing. Then they waited. Cade stayed with her the whole time, helping hold Mrs. Henderson down when she thrashed, bringing water when Mara asked for it, keeping the fire going. "You've done this before," he said quietly, during one of the brief moments when Mrs. Henderson was resting. "Too many times. People get hurt in camps and settlements, no doctors. You learn or people die." "Did you lose anyone?" "My younger sister. Fever took her when she was 9. Nothing I did helped." Mara didn't look at him when she said it. "That's when I realized knowing things wasn't the same as being able to fix things. Sometimes you do everything right, and people still die. But you keep trying. What else is there?" By morning, Mrs. Henderson's fever broke. She woke confused and weak but lucid, and Henderson cried when his wife recognized him and asked for water. "You saved her," he said to Mara, voice thick with emotion. "She saved herself. I just helped." "How do I repay you?" Mara looked at this broken man in his cold house and thought about Boon and all the ranchers living in fear of what came next. "Tell the truth," she said. "When people ask what happened, tell them we helped. Tell them Cade Mercer didn't turn you away even though he's barely surviving himself. Tell them we're not enemies out here. We're neighbors, and neighbors help each other." Henderson nodded slowly. "I'll tell them." Word spread faster than Mara expected. Within a week, 3 more families had shown up at Black Hollow Ranch asking for help. One needed food, one needed medicine. One just needed somewhere warm to stay for a few days while they waited out mechanical problems with their wagon. Mara helped them all. Not because they could afford to. They couldn't. Every bit of food they shared was food they wouldn't have later. Every hour spent helping others was time not spent on their own survival. But Cade never once suggested turning anyone away. "This is what my wife would have done," he said when Mara pointed out how low their supplies were getting. She believed community mattered more than profit, that keeping people alive was more important than keeping accounts balanced. She was right, Mara said, but she was also probably stressed constantly about money. Definitely. Something that might have been affection flickered in his expression. "You remind me of her sometimes. Not in appearance, but in the way you refuse to give up even when giving up would be easier." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." He paused. "But yes, also a compliment." They were standing in the barn checking on the livestock during a brief break in the weather. Snow had stopped falling, but the temperature hadn't risen above freezing in weeks. "Can I ask you something?" Cade said after a moment. "Sure." "Why are you really here? Not the surface reason about needing work. The real reason." Mara was quiet for a long time, watching the horses shift in their stalls. "I spent years running from places that were falling apart. Thought if I kept moving, I could stay ahead of the collapse. But everywhere I went, things fell apart anyway. And I finally realized I wasn't running from places. I was running from myself. From the fear that if I stayed anywhere long enough, people would see I was just as broken as everything else. And now? Now I'm tired of running, and I figured if I'm going to be broken, might as well be broken somewhere that matters, with people who matter." Cade reached out slowly, carefully, and took her hand. His palm was rough with calluses, his fingers cold from the barn air. "You matter," he said quietly. "To all of us. But especially to me." Mara looked at their joined hands and felt something shift in her chest. Not the crack widening, the opposite. Like pieces that had been broken for years were finally starting to fit back together. "I know," she said. "You matter to me too." They stood like that for a moment, just holding hands in a frozen barn while the world tried to kill them from 6 different directions at once. Then Eli's voice called from outside, "Mara! Father! Someone's coming!" They dropped hands and moved to the barn entrance. 3 riders approaching through the snow. Not attacking, just riding steady and careful. As they got closer, Mara recognized Tom Henderson and 2 other ranchers she'd met briefly when helping distribute food. "What's wrong?" Cade called out. "Nothing's wrong," Henderson said, dismounting. "We came to talk." They gathered in the main room of the house where it was warmest,
and the three ranchers stood awkwardly while Cade made space for everyone. Henderson spoke first. "We've been talking, all of us, about what you did for my wife, about how you've been helping people even though you're barely holding on yourselves." "It's what neighbors do," Cade said. "Maybe, but Boon doesn't see it that way. He's been squeezing us all separately, picking us off one by one. We've been too scared to work together because working together meant making ourselves targets." Henderson looked at the other two ranchers, who nodded. "But watching what you've been doing here, seeing how you fight back, we want to try. We want to organize." Mara felt her pulse quicken. This was it. This was the opening they needed. "Organize how?" she asked carefully. "Pool resources, share labor, create a network, so if Boon comes after one of us, he's coming after all of us." The second rancher, a man named Carson, spoke up. "We're all barely surviving separately. Together we might actually have a chance." "Boon won't like it," Cade warned. "Boon hasn't liked anything we've done for the last 5 years," the third rancher said. "His name was Miller, and he looked angry enough to spit. Tired of living scared. Rather fight and lose than just wait to die." They spent the next hour working out details. Who could spare what resources? How they'd coordinate during emergencies? What they'd do if Boon retaliated? It wasn't much, but it was something, a foundation to build on. After the ranchers left, Jonah turned to Mara with something like respect in his eyes. "That was your plan from the beginning, wasn't it? Help people so they'd help us back." "No," Mara said honestly. "I helped people because it was the right thing to do. The fact that it's also strategic is just a bonus. But you knew it would work." "I hoped it would work. Hope and knowing are different things." 2 weeks later, Boon made his move. His men came at night just like everyone knew they would eventually. Not sneaking, riding openly, carrying torches, making their presence known. Mara woke to the sound of horses and shouting and was out of bed with her boots on before full consciousness caught up. The boys were already awake, faces pressed to windows, watching the riders circle the property. "How many?" Cade asked, pulling on his coat. 8, Jonah said. "Maybe 9. Hard to tell in the dark." "They're not attacking yet," Mara observed. "Just circling. They want us to see them." "Intimidation," Micah said. "Make us scared so we do something stupid." "Then we don't do anything stupid." Mara grabbed her own coat. "Cade, get the boys into the root cellar. All of them. Now." "I'm not hiding," Jonah started. "You're not hiding. You're protecting the younger ones while we handle this." Mara's tone left no room for argument. "Move." Jonah looked like he wanted to fight, but Cade nodded. "Do it. Take care of your brothers. The boys disappeared toward the root cellar while Mara and Cade moved to the front porch. The riders had stopped circling and were now arranged in a loose line facing the house. One of them rode forward. Not someone Mara recognized. Young, wearing a gun like he knew how to use it. "Mr. Boon sends his regards," the rider called out. "Says you've been making trouble, organizing the neighbors against him. That's not friendly behavior." "We're helping people survive," Cade said. "That's not trouble. That's community." "Mr. Boon sees it different. He thinks you're trying to undermine his legitimate business interests, and he wanted me to remind you what happens to people who interfere." The rider gestured, and 2 of his men rode toward the barn carrying torches. Mara understood immediately. "They're going to burn it." She was moving before Cade could stop her, running toward the barn while behind her Cade shouted for her to wait. She didn't wait. Couldn't wait. The barn held their remaining livestock, their tools, everything they needed to survive. She reached the barn just as the first rider threw his torch onto the roof. The dry wood caught immediately, flames spreading faster than she thought possible. The horses inside screamed. Mara didn't think, just ran inside, into smoke and heat and terror, feeling her way to the stalls by memory more than sight. Found the first horse, got the gate open, slapped it toward the door. Did the same with the second. The third. Smoke was choking her now, eyes streaming, lungs burning, but there were 3 more horses and she couldn't leave them. She found the 4th, got it free, turned for the 5th, and the smoke was too thick to see anything at all. Just heat and darkness and the sound of wood cracking overhead. Then someone grabbed her arm and dragged her backward. Cade. He'd followed her in. Together they freed the last 2 horses and stumbled toward the door, just as part of the roof collapsed behind them, sending sparks exploding into the night. They fell out into the snow, coughing, gasping, clothes singed. The riders were still there, watching. The young one who'd spoken earlier looked almost disappointed that they'd survived. But before he could say anything, more horses appeared, riders coming from different directions. Henderson and Carson and Miller and half a dozen other ranchers, all armed, all forming a line between Boon's men and the burning barn. "You boys need to leave," Henderson called out. "Right now." The young rider looked uncertain for the first time. "We're just delivering a message." Message delivered. Now get out before this turns into something nobody wants. For a moment, it could have gone either way, could have turned into violence, could have ended with people dead in the snow. Then the young rider turned his horse. "This isn't over." "It never is," Henderson agreed. "But tonight it is. Now ride." They rode. And Mara sat in the snow watching the barn burn while neighbors she'd helped started organizing a bucket line to keep the fire from spreading to other buildings. Cade knelt beside her. "You almost died." "Horses would have died." "You're not a horse." "Neither are you, but you came in after me." He didn't have an answer for that. Just helped her stand and they joined the bucket line, working through the night to contain the damage. By dawn, the barn was gone. Just a smoking ruin of charred wood and twisted metal. But the house was safe. The other buildings were safe. The livestock was safe. And standing in the yard as the sun rose were a dozen ranchers who'd ridden through a winter night to help defend neighbors they barely knew. "We can rebuild the barn," Henderson said. "All of us together. Pool lumber. Share labor. Have it up before the next storm." "You don't have to," Cade started. "Yeah, we do. That's the whole point of organizing. We protect each other. Boon hurt you, he hurt all of us. So we rebuild. Together." And they did. Over the next 2 weeks, ranchers from across the valley showed up with lumber and tools and labor. They worked in shifts, building a new barn that was actually better than the old one. Stronger. Better insulated. Designed for surviving harsh winters. Boon tried to stop it, sent his men to intimidate workers, cut supply lines, even tried to get the bank to foreclose on one of the participating ranchers to make an example. But every time he pushed, the network pushed back, loaned money to keep people current on debts, shared resources to replace what Boon destroyed, organized guards to protect property. They weren't winning, exactly, but they weren't losing either. And not losing was a kind of victory when you'd been losing for years. Winter ground on. More storms. More cold. More days of wondering if they'd make it to spring. But they made it. Slowly, stubbornly, held together by shared determination and Mara's preserved food and the fact that no one was willing to give Boon the satisfaction of seeing them quit. Spring came late that year, arriving in March with temperatures that finally rose above freezing and snow that started melting in earnest. The crops they'd planted survived. Not all of them, but enough. Potatoes and turnips and winter squash that had weathered the cold underground and were now ready to harvest. They pulled them up in muddy fields, sorting good from bad, calculating yields with nervous precision. When they finished counting, Jonah looked at Mara with something like awe. "We've got enough to feed ourselves through next winter, and enough left over to sell." "How much?" Cade asked. "At least $200 worth. Maybe $300 if we get good prices. Enough to pay next year's banknote. Enough to buy new livestock. Enough to prove the diversification strategy worked." "We did it," Daniel said quietly. "We actually survived." "Not just survived," Mara corrected. "We built something. Something that's going to last." That night they celebrated with a dinner that used actual fresh vegetables instead of preserved ones, and the boys ate until they were stuffed and then ate more just because they could. Later, Cade found Mara on the porch watching the sunset paint the valley in colors that looked almost peaceful. "I have something to ask you," he said, sounding nervous. "All right, this past winter, watching you fight for this place, for this family, I realized something." He was choosing his words carefully. "You're not just helping us survive. You're part of us, part of this family, and I'd like to make that official, if you're willing." Mara turned to look at him. "Official how?" "Marry me." He said it simply without flourish. "Not because you're convenient or because the boys need a mother, though they do, but because somewhere between the cooking and the card dealing and the barn fire, I fell in love with you. And I think maybe you feel the same way."
Mara felt tears prick her eyes and didn't try to stop them. That's a terrible proposal. I know. You didn't even get on one knee. Seemed too formal for us.
And you're proposing on a porch while I'm covered in mud from harvesting potatoes. When's a better time? She laughed, actually laughed, and realized she couldn't remember the last time something had felt this right. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you, but only if you promise to let me keep making decisions about the ranch. Wouldn't dream of stopping you. He smiled, and it was genuine and warm and everything she'd learned to live without thinking she'd never have again. You're better at it than I am anyway. They married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch with all the boys standing witness and half the valley in attendance. Murphy even showed up, bringing a bottle of whiskey as a wedding gift and making a joke about Mara being the only dealer he'd ever met who'd gambled her way into a family. Eli cried during the vows. Micah pretended not to cry, but failed. Even Finn smiled, which was about as demonstrative as he got. And Mara stood there in a simple dress, holding hands with a man she'd met 4 months ago, while promising to spend the rest of her life in a place she'd planned to stay only one night, and felt something she'd never felt before. Complete. Not because everything was perfect. It wasn't. They still had debts. Still had Boon circling like a predator waiting for weakness. Still had hard years ahead trying to build something sustainable. But she had people, real people who knew her and chose her anyway, who fought beside her, who'd become the family she'd spent her whole life thinking she didn't deserve. Boon showed up uninvited to the wedding reception, which surprised no one. He stood at the edge of the gathering, watching with that same smile while people deliberately turned their backs on him. Finally, he approached Cade and Mara, where they stood talking with the Hendersons. Congratulations, Boon said. Didn't think you had it in you, Mercer. Fighting back, organizing resistance, actually surviving. He puffed his cigar. Impressive. If you're here to threaten us again, Cade started, I'm here to admit defeat. Boon said it casually, like admitting the weather was cold. For now, anyway. You've built something I can't easily break, not without turning the entire valley against me, which would be bad for business. So I'm backing off. Consider this ranch off limits. For the time being. For the time being, Mara repeated. Nothing's permanent, Miss Vale. You know that better than most. He tipped his hat. Enjoy your victory. You earned it. But remember, I'm still here, still watching, and if you ever give me an opening, I'll take it. He walked away, leaving them standing there trying to figure out if they'd actually won or just bought themselves a temporary reprieve. Does this mean it's over? Eli asked, appearing beside Mara and taking her hand. For now, Mara said, squeezing back. But that's enough. We take victories when we can get them, even temporary ones. And after temporary? After temporary, we keep fighting. Together. That's what families do. Eli nodded, satisfied with that answer in the way children were satisfied when they trusted the adults saying it. Years later, when people told the story of Black Hollow Ranch, they focused on different parts depending on who was telling it. Some people talked about the winter the valley organized against Boon and won. Some talked about the woman who gambled 3 nights at Murphy's to save a family that wasn't even hers. Some talked about the barn fire and the rescue that should have killed everyone involved but somehow didn't. But the people who'd lived it, Cade and Mara and 6 boys who'd learned what family actually meant, they remembered something different. They remembered that survival wasn't about being strong or smart or lucky, though those things helped. Survival was about refusing to quit, even when quitting made perfect sense. About helping people who couldn't help themselves. About building something permanent in a world that seemed determined to tear everything apart. And most of all, survival was about choosing to stay, when leaving would be easier. About committing to people and places even when that commitment came with no guarantees and every reason to be afraid. Mara learned that lesson the hard way, running from places for years before finally finding somewhere worth staying. And Black Hollow Ranch stopped being a dying property at the edge of nowhere and became something else entirely. A home. Imperfect and struggling and held together with determination more than resources. But home nonetheless. The kind of place where a woman carrying 2 carpet bags could show up planning to stay one night and end up building a life. Where 6 boys who'd forgotten how to hope could learn to be a family again. Where a broken man drowning in debt could remember what it felt like to fight for something that mattered. It wasn't a perfect ending because real life didn't have perfect endings. There were still hard years ahead, still debts to manage, Still threats on the horizon. But standing on the porch of Black Hollow Ranch on a spring evening, watching the sun set over land they'd fought to keep, surrounded by people who'd chosen to fight beside them, Mara understood something fundamental about the difference between surviving and living. Surviving was what you did when you had no choice. Living was what you did when you found people worth suffering for. And she'd finally found hers.